Power Podcast.
Hey guys, welcome to another podcast here. Going to talk about some things surrounding the NBA. Apologize for the inactivity in the podcast. It's just with this coronavirus, it has totally wiped out most available content, and I didn't want to give you guys a bunch of rehash content. So whenever something, that you've heard from, 5 million different sources. So I decided whenever something comes out that has real conversation to it, I decided, hey, let's talk about it. So this Jalen Green G League contract, I think, is a huge conversation. It's a conversation that I don't know if people are really prepared to have. I think there's a lot of college basketball apologists, and I think there's a lot of people on the other side who are a little too excited in a way that would make it appear as though the NCAA is going to go out of business, which isn't going to happen. So let me start off by saying I talked to a guy who I have a great deal of respect for, Mike DeCourcy of the Sporting News, and we had an interesting. It was very short, unfortunately. I was busy with just doing house stuff this past Sunday, but I wanted to talk to him about an article he had wrote about the, I guess you'd call it the effects of the Jalen Green signing to the G League. And we started to have this small conversation, but I didn't really get a chance to expound on it. I think part of the issue with the G League and their involvement now is that I think people want to talk just about the players. Because I think when we talk about the Isaiah Todds that have signed and the Jalen Greens that have signed, that it leaves the way for us to not talk about the real culprit in all this. And the real culprit in all this is the NCAA. They're the ones that have, unfortunately, tied the hands of the NBA. And the NBA, unfortunately, is trying to undo the damage. I can't call it damage, but more like they're trying to undo the false agenda that they set up when they put on the extra year that created the one and done. If anybody who's followed my work for quite some time knows that I am somebody who was totally against the NBA's age limit rule. I thought it was disrespectful to North American players. I didn't feel as though it allowed players the opportunities. To me, I think what to me is frustrating about the NBA age limit rule is not that I have an issue with wanting what's best. It's that, to me, it wasn't designed for the betterment of the players. It was designed, in my eyes, for two things. Number one, to give the NBA some cover for these players leaving early. And number two, to help colleges. Because the NBA looked at the NCAA tournament as a way to gain publicity and pub for its upcoming stars. And that worked wonders in the 70s and 80s. Well, let me put it like this. It worked wonders in the 80s because and the 90s because the NBA really didn't have its blow up until the Magic Johnson, Larry Bird. And really the NCAA has struggled to create a rival of that. I mean, Larry Bird and Magic Johnson, I don't think people... I know most basketball people understand, but I don't think people know just how much of a perfect storm that was. And that even though they helped bring in all these people into the NBA, it was just a different time. I mean, you couldn't have scripted any better. I mean, Magic Johnson, an African American with a great smile, and he plays at a major school, Michigan State. takes on a white country bred kid that's playing at a small school, Indiana State. And I think people just, it was, you couldn't script better if you wrote it down. If I wrote this in a movie, people would say, come on, you're stereotyping. I mean, that's how perfect this was. And I think the NBA has tried, and I think with some measure of success, they've had certain guys like Patrick Ewing, Ralph Sampson, who've come in with a little bit more of a pedigree. The Fab Five with Chris Webber. And look, there's been other guys too. But has there been people that have matched the layer of domination of the headlines the way that Magic and Bird did? And the quick answer is no, not even close. Because again, it was the perfect storm. It was black versus white. It was country versus it was urban versus suburban. It was everything. And even when it went into the NBA, it's again perfectly scripted. Larry Bird goes to the Boston Celtics. Magic Johnson goes to the Lakers. It's showtime. It's grittiness. Like everything, every label of that you could think of, it was there for them. It was incredible. And I don't think we'll ever see somebody on that level again that can create these type of complex stories the way that Bird and Magic did. So what I'm basically getting at is the NBA has used the NCAA tournament as really a springboard into their product with Joe Sixpack and the mainstream public. And it worked great for many years. But with the advent of the one and done and Kevin Garnett in 1995 changing the landscape, it definitely changed, I think, some of what the NBA wanted. I mean, after Garnett left, you had Kobe Bryant, you had Jermaine O'Neal, you had Tracy McGrady, you had Al Harrington, you had Jonathan Bender. I mean, there were so many different guys that were coming out year in and year out. Tyson Chandler, Eddie Curry. So, I mean, there were so many guys with these pedigrees that were now skipping past the NBA. So the NBA, and listen, the people can talk what they want. I've researched, I've done the due diligence. I was around during this time. The layer of, I would say, journalistic attack was at an all-time high with the NBA every time a player went pro out of high school. There was always a full-court attack on the NBA product, on the NBA, and with these character assassinations in some regards that writers were doing, I think David Stern grew tired of it, and I think he grew tired of having to keep with the conversation. Now, again, another thing that doesn't get talked about a lot, and I kind of see if I can find the video, but he was, and I remember it was on ESPN. He was interviewed, and a writer asked him, a host asked him, do you think some of this attack against high school players declaring pro has to do with the fact of them being African Americans? And he said, yeah, I think on some layer there is that. He said, I know it's not all of that, but I do think on some layer there is that. So there was, there's so many different sides to this. Now you'll have guys that'll come out and say, well, no, that's not, there was no race involved with the NBA's decision. And but you have the guy who instituted the rule that believes that race did play a part in the perceptions of high school athletes. Like, you have this guy, this is what he's saying. I mean, he was the commissioner of the NBA that helped set the rule that created the one and done scenario. So, you can't discount it totally. I mean, there is some validity to that conversation. And then on the other end, I would get frustrated because you clearly would have a sense of disconnect between that and the international market. I mean, meanwhile, the international market basically is allowed to declare as many times as they want to for that period of time when we only declare twice. The international market was able to basically get into the NBA as basically a teenager. which you couldn't do as a North American player. So it really seemed to hamper and be a rule that was set up against North American players. It did not seem to be a rule that the NCAA, not the NCAA, but the NBA instituted and put together at the basis of trying to create this unified rule. It seemed like it was a rule that was strictly created to be against North American players. I don't know how else you can word that. On the flip side, I think after this happened, it created, I think, this monster in the tunnel where it was a Faustian bargain, if you will. On one end, we gave up the ability of the one and done. On the other end, we allowed the floodgates of one and done to happen. And I know people might discount what I'm about to say here, but I've talked to some of these kids, and I asked a couple of them off record, is the one and done rule, did it spur you to declare early? And some of them said yes, and I think some of them said yes, and one guy said, look, I declared, but I also don't have a gauge anymore. It used to be when guys declared out of high school and went into the NBA and you saw certain guys didn't do well, you're like, well, shit, he was above me. Maybe I need to stay and gather some more skills before I make that jump. That doesn't happen anymore. It's become a process of I'm going to go because I can go. And that's really what it created. And don't get me wrong, one and done has certainly created some stars. It's helped quite a bit. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But I think on the flip side, what we have started to see especially over the last 5 years, is the advent of the social media. Now, again, social media has been around for quite a while, but these addendums of, MySpace is around for the longest, but and I'm not even talking about Facebook. I'm talking about, Instagram. These guys are getting ridiculous followers, so they're building in that following at a pretty high rate offline now. Like they don't even have to go to campus now, and they're already coming in with a fan base. And people love to discount that point because, again, it's because they need to prop up their position. And what I mean by that is, if your position is that college works, you're not going to take any bit of confidence in social media. You're not going to say that social media does anything. So I think for me, what I'm talking about is this. Growing up as a college basketball fan, you would hear rumblings of guys, but you never knew. You never knew who these guys were. And I'm talking about, I remember playing basketball on the courts, and, guys would be like, man, did you hear about that kid in Cali? I'm like, who's the kid you talking about? Shea Cotton. And then another guy would say, you hear about the kid in Cali? Shea Cotton. So it was funny because guys would have slight variations in the names because, depending on where they got the information from. And really, that's basically how basketball talent was talked about. It was like this rumor in the park. It was like, hey, that kid Shea Cotton, he's really good. But no one saw the guy. We would see maybe if they did a news, a 60-minute special report, or maybe you had a friend that went to California and happened to catch a game. But very far and few did you really know what Shea Cotton even looked like. And I remember I picked up a Slam magazine. Was it Slam? It might not even been Slam. I'm trying to remember. I go back that far. I think it was Slam. They had an article highlighting the best players of that class. And Shea Cotton, there was a picture of Shea Cotton there or maybe it was Sports Illustrated. I can't even remember. But there was a picture of Shea Cotton. And I remember I said, man, this kid, this is the next guy. Like, we didn't really know. I mean, basically what I'm getting at is we didn't know anything. And again, if you're an old school college basketball fan like me, you picked up a Sporting News or a some college annual, and you'd read through and you would see who got what recruits. You didn't even know when guys recruited to colleges. Like, that's how far removed we were from the recruiting world. We didn't even know when our teams got players. We didn't even know. Again, I was a UNLV fan. I was a North Carolina fan. I remember 1990 when I heard that UNLV was going to get Larry Johnson. I didn't know we got Larry Johnson until the following year, because I saw that he was an up and coming JUCO, because Streets and Smith, which used to be the college basketball Bible, you would see they would cover like 2 pages of JUCO. It was literally 2 pages, and most of the time it was their height, what junior college they went to, and their name. Like, that's basically all you had. You didn't really have anything else. And the following year, they would do a special, a page where they would show where the next JUCOs were moving, or like what colleges they were going to. Larry Johnson was a little bit different because he was a McDonald's All-American, so there was a little bit of excitement about him. He was considered the top JUCO player, so he had a little feature done on him. I mean, I didn't know about Larry Johnson until I read that. I never saw him play until he suited up for UNLV. And what I'm basically getting at is, in this era of basketball, the average college fan not only knows what school these guys are attending, they know what AAU program they're a part of. They've already watched, anywhere between 3 to 5 mixtapes. They know, when they're I mean, you actually have commitment dates. Like, we didn't even know when guys were committed to colleges. Like, we had no clue. It wasn't like it was a ticker or even unless it was a local guy. Like, you didn't know. You had no clue when a guy, I remember one of the first ones I kind of remember that I saw was Kobe Bryant's cousin, Jonathan Cox. He was a player in Philadelphia. He declared his college choice. It was for San Francisco. And his dad, Chubby Cox, used to play at San Francisco. But I remember, and that was a local kid. So, we're not even talking like it was a situation where it was national. Like, this was a local kid. I mean, I live in Delaware. Philly's like right up the street from me. So, yeah, they covered it on local news, but it was covered in local news. It wasn't covered at ESPN. It wasn't like there was no real recruiting websites. Now, don't get me wrong. There was one recruiting website at that time. And I want to say about the late 90s is when I started to be a subscriber of it. It was called Prep Stars or Blue Chip Illustrated. I want to say there was 2 versions of them. There was Prep Stars and there was Blue Chip Illustrated. I begged my grandmother to get me a subscription. So she called the number. We filled out the form from the magazine and we sent it in. And I had got my subscriptions. It would come like a little mini magazine. And Prep Stars Online was actually the first time, I want to say 97, that came out, where you could go online and you could get some data on the players. But you still couldn't have video, but at least you knew names, you knew some of the backstories, you knew maybe what they averaged per game, but that was about it. So what I'm getting at with all this as I'm building up is today's basketball player doesn't do none of that. Today's basketball fan doesn't have to do any of that. We know everything about these guys. So when guys sit there and they discount the social media revolution that's happened, it's online and no videos to now we've gone into we know what they ate for breakfast, we know what their girlfriends are, we like all this data is out there now. The average fan did not get all that. I mean, you got 24/7, you got ESPN now, you got what is it, Insiders or Rival, I don't know. There's so many different places now you can go for recruiting information. It's not even funny. And you can even get recruiting information tied to your school. So if you have a school that you like, maybe you're a Duke Blue Devil fan or a North Carolina fan, you actually get data that is recruiting that's geared to just your school. So when Roy Williams even went to a guy's house and had a conversation with him, all this data is out there now. So what I'm saying is Jalen Green, Zion Williamson, they are there now. And I've heard people, it's like Zion Williamson. Zion Williamson had 1 million+ followers before he ever stepped foot on Duke. That's a fact. Now, I've heard people say, well, Duke made him a household name. With who? Because he was going to be number 1 pick if he played at Little Sisters in the Poor. Again, and I'm not discounting that associating yourself with a brand doesn't have value. Of course it does. But what I'm saying is a guy like Jalen Green, of course, associating yourself with a brand is important. Of course. But at the end of the day, it's just funny to me how we keep changing the goalposts. We keep moving it. First, it was about education. And I know this because, like I said, I was around during the Kevin Garnett, Kobe Bryant, Tracy McGrady fiascos. I read online. I researched to a great deal about the information surrounding Moses Malone, Daryl Dawkins, and Bill Willoughby, who were the first 3 modern prep to pros players. And Moses was basically a curiosity. I mean, he literally was so dominant. He was looked at as like a once-in-a-lifetime player, so there really wasn't any backlash, I guess you could call it. I think there was. I think if there was backlash, it was more directed towards the ABA for maybe tainting him with going after professional money instead of going to college and pursuing a college degree. Bill Willoughby and Daryl Dawkins, again, more oddities. But with Bill Willoughby, there started to be that conversation where maybe, college should be, targeted. And then you have the Kevin Garnett, Kobe Bryant. It was all about education. They're missing education. And now that's kind of gone. So now it's not about education now. Now it's about, branding. Well, yeah, you have to switch it up because now you know what the name of the game is. The name of the game is money. And I think that's the one part that everybody doesn't want to talk about. Now, people love counting players' dollars. Like, they love talking about Jalen Green, Isaiah Todd, and how much they're signing with the G League, and da-da-da-da, and they're saying all this other stuff. Okay, great. Good points all around. But I think, why are we talking about just the players? Like, why are we talking about just these guys? Why are we not talking about the bigger picture? And the bigger picture with the more context to it is that the NCAA, which is supposed to be a controlling body of amateurism, has for years arrived at unfiltered and unmitigated funds, and we're talking about in the billions, that they never, ever had to pay their workforce. Mark Emmert, NCAA makes $2.4 million. $2.4 million. To put it in perspective, an NBA commissioner makes $10 million, $8 to $10 million. That's what Adam Silver's getting. This guy's getting 2.4 for doing amateurism. I'm going to say that again. Amateurism. One more time for the people in the back. Amateurism. $2.4 million. That's what he's getting paid. Richard Pitino, who works at Minnesota. Okay, respectable coach, respectable program. Guess how much he's making? About $3.5 million. Now, you may be saying to yourself, but Matt, that's not really that much. You got Coach K, he's making like $9 million. Yeah, you're right. 3.5 isn't that much. But if I told you that $3.5 million in the NBA would literally make you the 22nd or 24th highest paid coach in the NBA, then you would sit there and be like, oh, this is even the bigger caper with this. Richard Pitino isn't a top 20 paid head coach. He is in top 30. He's in top 40. He is the 52nd highest paid head coach in America. 52nd. People keep telling me, all these other things. But this is kind of what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a system that has been profitable and that has been sustainable for over 70 years. Okay, no doubt. But when people say that things are changing, this is what they're talking about. Irregardless of how well Jalen Green does, right? Maybe he doesn't do well. Maybe he doesn't. Who knows? I don't know. But right now, based on the body of work that he has generated in his high school career, he is worth $500,000. $500,000. That's right. $500,000. A guy like Jalen Green was going to these colleges for free. I'm going to say this again. A guy like Jalen Green who has showed that his market value is $500,000 was going to a college for free to help pay for Coach K's salary, John Calipari's salary, the athletic director's salary, the new field, the new stadium, the new facilities. That's what a guy like Jalen Green was worth. Tell me I'm wrong. That's what a market value is. Market value is not this thing that people want to come out and act like it is. Like I see people like trying to put all these addendums to it. Oh, well, is he really worth all that? It doesn't matter. That's his market value. That's what he's worth. Right now, the market dictates your price. That's what they're saying he's worth. Okay. And $500,000. That's what he's worth. Okay, so everybody else can make money off these guys, but the guys themselves making this kind of money. This is kind of what irritates me about this whole discussion, because it's so disingenuous at times, because to me, it's kind of ridiculous that Jalen Green is out here getting lit up by writers because he went out and the market determined he was worth $500,000. And you mad? And here's the truth. Half these writers out here, half these critics out here, if they can go out into the market and get $500,000, they would too. And that's a fact. They would be running to go get that. Like, it doesn't matter how well Jalen Green does. It doesn't matter how well Isaiah Todd does. The bottom line that we're getting at is this is how much they're worth without even putting forth anything else. What's the problem? I don't see it. College basketball is going to continue forever. As long as you have kids willing to go to a college for free, you're going to have a product. Like, it's going to happen. And some of those kids are going to be good enough that they're going to get drafted by the NBA. Sure, absolutely. But I think what we have to start being honest with is just because it may work for the majority of North American high school players does not mean that there's 15 North American high school players or 10 North American high school players who going pro helps them reach their goals faster. And why has everybody been out of shape about that? I just don't get it. We wouldn't be this bent out of shape with tennis. We're not this bent out of shape with any of these other sports. Hell, in this country, we can actually give you a gun and you can go die for war at 18 years old. 16 years old, we give you a license. 21 years old, we give you alcohol. And now we're sitting here and we're saying, oh, well, they can't make these decisions. I think that's complete hubris of people to think that everybody who's in this position can't think for themselves and can't make smart decisions. One of the things about basketball historically that's always been something of mine of a I guess you could call it a journey, because I've studied it and I've researched it, and it's things like this that intrigue me. Is we all know the stories of Shea Cotton, Esteban Weaver, transcendent talents that failed. Lloyd Daniels is another, or that we say failed. But what I'm always wondering about is, what if these guys had the ability to get away from their environments and just work on their games? Would we be having this conversation? What would happen? What would happen if Lloyd Daniels was removed from that whole situation and had nothing but the ability to work on his game? Shea Cotton, learning how to play as a guard instead of being a power forward his freshman and sophomore years in high school. We love to talk about these failures as though these failures are just on the individual. And don't get me wrong, there is definitely accountability to be had by the individual. But I think what we also have to understand too is the lack of us wanting to evolve this process has cost us too. Whether the NCAA changes what it does or not doesn't really matter. If the NBA is trying to create a minor league system, let them. Good. They should. They should be trying to get a real minor league system. What's wrong with that? I mean, I hear people complain all the time about what the NBA does. And don't get me wrong, the NBA is not a perfect organization. And there's a lot that needs to be changed and needs to be fixed. But at the end of the day, we can say a lot of things about Adam Silver. But the one thing we can say about him is he's not afraid to try. And for years, I've heard these guys out here, these basketball talking heads, talk about how the NBA needs a minor league. The NBA needs a minor league. The NBA needs a minor league. Then the NBA tries to create a minor league, and now we got people complaining about it. My whole take on this is it doesn't really matter, because college basketball is going to continue. The NBA is going to continue. Now, whether or not people want to lose their minds every time a prospect signs with a professional development league, that's on them. But I'll say this, and I'll wrap it up. One of the things I said to Mike, and I think that this is a big change from this perspective. You could, and look, it hasn't happened yet, and it might not happen. Okay, it might never happen. But you could theoretically see a world in which the top 20 players all sign developmental contracts with the G League. You really could see that happen. If that happens, will college basketball go on? Sure it will. Will it still produce NBA players? Sure it will. Will it have the power that it once had? That could be a different conversation. And people who know me, you know I love history, you know I do history. But for those of you out here who think the NCAA will never fall or will never lose power, I got one word for you. AAU. I guess that's 3 words. But AAU in the 1920s, in the formation, early basketball, From about the 1920s to the 60s is when it stopped having its power. But the AAU ruled basketball. I mean, they were drawing crowds way more than college basketball and way more than professional basketball. AAU basketball tournaments, which were usually comprised of college players or former college players, they would play for these groups. And they would, I mean, look, in the early 50s, you had guys leave schools to play for AAU teams for the year. And sometimes they would stay with those AAU programs. Sometimes they would go back to school. But what I'm saying is it was there for everybody. And they ran of the Olympics. Like Olympic basketball, a lot of times you'll see in the early 60s, early 50s, that a lot of it is AAU driven. AAU pretty much had a seat at the table, flexed a lot of power, had a lot of power, and then they lost it. So what I'm saying is college basketball will continue. It will always continue. It will always produce. But what we don't know is if you have this cumulative effect of over, say, 10 years, 100 kids don't play, how much power does it have? Well, that could honestly change. It really could. That's all I got to say about this. I'm sorry to talk everybody's head off too much, but I just really wanted to make sure that we were having a very contextualized and concise conversation. Please, as always, share. And I'll talk to you guys later. Peace.